City of Stevens Point Plan Commission meeting, recorded May 1st, 2023.
All right, I have 6 o'clock. We will call the regular City Plan Commission meeting to order. Adam, could we get a roll call, please?
Weeza.
Here.
Kneebone.
Here.
Arnson.
Here.
Cooper is excused. Ilton is excused. And Rice is excused. And lastly, Schuler.
Here.
We do have a quorum, so we will continue. First item on the agenda is the report for the April 3rd meeting of the City Plan Commission.
Move to approve.
Thank you.
Second.
Seconded by Kneebone. Discussion? Comments from the audience? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? And that is approved. Item number 3 is a public hearing and subsequent action on a request from John Kanoki for a conditional use permit to construct a second principal structure on a property located at 2001 Patch Street with the parcel identified in your packet, consistent with Chapter 23.01 Sub 14 Sub F. Adam.
Thank you, Mayor. So the applicant is requesting to construct a commercial building approximately 1,600 square feet in size on the property identified in the packet and shown on the screen. This proposed building will accommodate 2 commercial tenant spaces, and given the property's zoning under the
Let's say, could you zoom in on one of the screens, please, the TV screen, so the viewers later can see what we're talking about? Thank you.
Yeah, and given the property's B4 commercial zoning classification, the ability to have a commercial land use, generally speaking, is a permitted one. It is a permitted use. The reason for this conditional use permit request is, as you've seen for a lot of other projects more in the realm of duplex development, is that there's more than one principal structure on the same lot. So as the folks in the room may recall, about say a year ago now is when the dog wash facility was installed on the subject property. So with that principal structure already existing on the property, the construction of a second one, this commercial tenant, this commercial building would represent that second principal structure. So on the next slide, you see some just rough rendering showing just your basic site plan showing the setbacks. There's items that were mentioned in the staff report related to parking, shared access, and that's something that there's a little bit of flexibility as written in the staff report as to really how parking is provided, if it's provided either on site or off site by way of the existing parking stalls just directly adjacent to the subject property, which the applicant also owns. And then the image on the right shows the proposed rendering of this building, pretty customary for a commercial building, and will blend quite nicely with the South Point Plaza building to the southwest. So staff would recommend approval. There's about a little over half dozen conditions tied to this request, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, before we open up the public hearing, are there any clarifying questions that the commissioners need answered? Okay, we have several public hearings, so I'll go over the process because I see some new faces. Public hearings, I declare them open. If you have testimony, you approach the lectern, name and address, provide that testimony, and we'll keep the public hearing open as long as there's people willing to speak or wanting to speak. We declare we state that it's open 3 times. After no one responds after the 3rd time, we close the public hearing and then bring it back to the commission for action. So with that, I will declare the public hearing open on this particular item. Anyone wishing to offer testimony, step forward to the lectern, provide your name and address and that testimony. Public hearing remains open. And for the 3rd and final time, the public hearing is open. Seeing and hearing no one wishing to provide testimony, I will declare the public hearing closed and bring it back to the commissioners. Commissioners, what are your wishes?
I'd move to approve per staff recommendations.
Thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by Schuler. Discussion. Go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, there's the existing dog wash structure and this proposed structure. In the future, are there any other approvals required if the dog wash were to go away and another larger building were to be proposed? What would be the process for that?
Similar process as what's here before you tonight. So by removing the dog wash structure and then proposing to add a new one, you're essentially negating this conditional use request by way of adding this, and then by way of adding the second principal structure to replace the dog wash.
Okay.
That's where that conditional use would come into play.
Okay, any other questions? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And that is approved. Item number 4 is a public hearing and subsequent action on a request from Lori Gintner, representing Arthur Greco, to rezone an unaddressed parcel off 2nd Street North with the parcel identified in your packet from B1 neighborhood business to R3 single and two-family residential. Adam?
Thank you, Mayor. So as the Mayor just mentioned, the subject property is zoned B1 neighborhood business and has been, at least in my time with the city, has been a property that's been brought up to me from quite some time, just given its undeveloped state and the interest in possibly developing that to some sort of use. So the applicant is proposing as a condition of purchasing the property to rezone the property to the R3 single and two-family residence district for the purpose of building a residential home. The applicant has had discussions with me, more fluid conversations as to either a single-family one-unit residence or two-unit residence. Both of those types of uses would be permitted in the R3 district. And if I maybe just backtrack a little bit, the nature for this request, there's really two paths to go down. The first path was to retain the B1 neighborhood business zoning designation and ask for a conditional use permit by this body. And the second would have been to apply for this rezoning request. And staff's perspective is that given the future land use recommendation for the subject property, given the adjoining land uses surrounding the property, primarily single-family residential with some more multifamily to the west or to the east, that asking for this rezoning request is the better route of the two. So ultimately, the report gives some background as to really the three standards that staff and this commission looks at with respect to any rezoning request. Impact on the performance standards for that given district, compatibility with the city's comprehensive plan, and then just overall impact on the surrounding neighborhood. Given this area is kind of one of the two hodgepodge areas of the city with respect to kind of spot zoning, as you see in the staff report, by applying a R3 zoning designation, getting rid of the commercial zoning, arguably reduces that hodgepodge of different zoning classifications and makes it more uniform. So I don't see the applicant here in person, but I'd be happy to take any questions on her behalf.
Okay. Any clarifying questions before we open up this public hearing?
I appreciate staff's clarification. I thought hodgepodge was an overlay district, but here it's just a...
It had been
Naturally
proposed
occurred.
initially as an overlay district,
Okay.
but it's not currently.
Okay, thank you.
There would be some hodgepodge grandfathering if we would have done that, but we didn't.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
You guys are killing me. All right, I'll declare the public hearing open.
Thank you very much. Sean Morrow, I'm the older person in this area. That's District 11. I talked to all three neighbors in regard to this. No one has an issue. They'd rather have a residence there than a business. And so there's no real problems with that. I also talked to the applicant as well at a length, and she kind of just described what she was trying to end up doing. She's disabled. She's trying to build a home for herself, and she's also going to have a place for a live-in caregiver at some point as well. And the only income she has now is her Social Security, so she's hoping to maybe help with some. She's going to try to help the reading. She's going to try to help some others, get something in there to get some extra cash in there as well. But everything sounds really. I mean, she kind of described the plans for her house as well. She had some further questions about that, and I referred her to Ryan for any questions in regard to some setbacks and so on, which I'm not really sure of. But according to the neighbors that are there, they'd be happy that's there's something there besides a bunch of signs during the election seasons. Thank you.
Thanks. Public hearing remains open. Anyone wishing to offer testimony on this request, step forward.
Mary Ann Leszewski. Are there, just although it says it's an unaddressed parcel, are there any landmarks or ways to distinguish where this location is?
Corner of North Point and Second.
Okay, thank you.
I'll bring it up on the map again here, Mary Ann, so you can see. This is Spash's new building, if you can see that. 2nd Street, North Point. Spash is over on this side. Public hearing remains open. Public hearing is still open. For the third and final time, the public hearing remains open. Seeing and hearing no one wishing to provide further testimony, I'll declare the public hearing closed. Bring it back to the commissioners. Commissioners, what are your wishes?
Move to approve subject to staff recommendations.
Thank you. And somebody, seconded by Arnson. Discussion.
I think it's a good use for the neighborhood. I mean, we could use a little
It's
more
sat
housing.
vacant for quite a
and-
few years, and housing is always a
Yeah.
challenge, so I think it's a good use.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And that is approved. Item number 5 is a request from Associated Bank for a sign variance to install 2 freestanding signs on a property located at 1305 Main Street with the parcel identified in your packet, consistent with Chapter 25.14. This is not a public hearing, but Adam, give us some background.
Thank you, Mayor. So the request before you tonight is part of a much broader, much larger revamp of existing signage that's located on the property, including some tweaks to the existing directional signage, swapping out the directional signage for new signs, those of which can be reviewed and approved internally. These 2 freestanding signs, the one existing sign off of Clark Street, the other existing freestanding sign off of Main Street is requesting to be removed and replaced with a new freestanding sign at each location, like for like in relation to height, 17 feet in terms of size, 57 square feet in signable area, and as well as the general location of it. So as you can see on the image on the screen shows just a rough mock-up of what the proposed signs will look like, pretty identical to the existing signs at those 2 locations. On the next slide, we'll go into the meat of the sign code regulations and why we're here. So within the B3 Central Business District, essentially our downtown area, there's those freestanding sign regulations pertaining to height, size, and then the sign base that I mentioned. And you can see for the first 2, for the height and for the size, there's differing requirements as to if a sign is located on a property that does or does not abut a residential use. You can see this is a pretty large parcel, about a little over 3 acres in size. And while it's predominantly borders commercial uses, there are a few single-family residential homes to the east, which would thus require these more restrictive regulations in terms of size and in terms of height. So overall, looking at the 3 variance standards, staff would recommend approval. The one thing I would note, just to expand a little bit further, is that for any variance request, there's added concern, there's added review in terms of the impact on said variance relative to the broader neighborhood. And just given the location of the sign in the downtown area, there's more safeguards that's automatically placed on this request that you see as conditions within this report, meeting vision triangles, meeting design requirements from a historic preservation standpoint. So staff would recommend approval. We do have the applicant here in person that can answer any questions as well.
Okay, are there any questions from the commissioners? Yes, sir.
I was wondering, Adam, if you're aware of any calls that staff has received regarding the operation of the existing lights. They've been there a long time in their current configuration. Has there ever been any comment from the public on that?
I have not received any, no.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I guess I'm just still, the code specifies 32 square feet, and these are going to be 57 square feet. So is that part of the exemption? I don't see it as really called out.
Correct. So that's the 3 exemptions would be increasing increase in height, increase in size, and then the sign base.
And the height is related to its position near a residential?
Near residential uses, correct.
Okay, yep.
And as you can see, I mentioned in the report, it's about, this proposed signs are roughly 180, 190 feet away from the adjoining residential lots.
Yep, okay, good, thanks.
Any other questions? Comments from the audience or anyone online? Hearing and seeing none, I would accept a motion
I'd make a motion to approve the request.
with staff recommendations.
Yes.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Kneebone. Discussion. Hearing and seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And that's approved. I really appreciate the fact that you remember there's only 3 people here that make motions, and you're doing a very good job of doing that, taking them on. Sometimes you'll sit there for a long time. All right, and now for our main event. Item number 6 is a public hearing and subsequent action on a request from the City of Stevens Point to amend Chapter 23 zoning ordinance of the revised municipal code of the City of Stevens Point. Said request amends Section 23.04 Sub 2 for the purposes of repealing the definition of family in its entirety and adopting the following definitions of the terms household entity plus, dependent, and owner-occupied dwelling. Does anybody need me to read all of the definitions? They are included in your packet and online. If anybody wants me to read them all, I will, reluctantly. Okay.
Could they be explained a little bit better because they're confusing?
Yes, and we will have, Ryan, do you want to do that, or you want to have Adam do the definitions?
Ryan can do it.
More than happy to explain.
Thanks. Go ahead and do that first, please.
Okay. So before you this evening, members of the Plan Commission, is the proposed definition of family. As hopefully you folks recall, over the last several months, we've been having this discussion. What we want the definition of family to look like, what changes we'd like to see before ultimately at the last, maybe not the last meeting, but a relatively recent meeting where we actually decided we're going to go down what city staff had referred to as the 3-2 option, wherein under the current definition of family, no more than 2 unrelated individuals can reside in the same dwelling unit. Under the proposed ordinance change before you, essentially, if you're an owner-occupied dwelling, you can have up to 3 unrelated individuals. That would include the owner-occupant, so it would be the owner-occupant plus 2, essentially. And if it's for lack of a better term, renter-occupied unit, you essentially fall under the existing definition of family. We've also updated actually struck the family definition, replaced with household entity, made some changes there, and then within the definition section of Chapter 23, we further defined things like dependent and owner-occupied dwellings. So again, in a nutshell, if it's owner-occupied, you can have up to 3 unrelated individuals. If it's a renter-occupied unit, you can have up to 2 unrelated individuals, consistent with what currently is within our zoning code.
Okay. Questions? Otherwise, I'll accept a motion.
Ahead of the public hearing?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a public hearing. I was still on the last one.
See
My
what we
fault.
did there
I
by not making
apologize.
the motion? Those 3? See
So,
what we
no,
did there?
you can't do a motion
We
yet.
did not make a motion.
I
We're doing
noticed
that well, too.
You are way more on the ball than I am, and thank you for that.
Existed there.
I will now declare the public hearing open. Anyone wishing to offer testimony at the public hearing on this request, step to the lectern, please. Public hearing okay. I knew there was a few.
Hi, I'm Jane Johnson, Stevens Point resident, and I was a member of the Housing Task Force. So what comes before us is what I would consider a watered-down recommendation. The task force actually recommended that we utilize the regulation that is already in place, which is based on people per square footage. But if that wasn't going to be good enough, then we would move to 4 people being able to be in unrelated, with no requirement of owner-occupied. So this has now been watered down to what already is, and the one little change is that if it's an owner-occupied unit, you can have 1 more person with you. First, this is just, I don't know, simple math in my head, but I was an English major, so maybe it doesn't work out in other people's heads. The fewer people who can be in rentals, the more not owner-occupied rentals there will be needed. Just, you do the math. So, this recommendation is not creating the room that we really need to have. We have a housing crisis. As somebody who works downtown with folks on the economic margins, I can tell you that there is not enough housing. We've heard, as this got argued from John Gardner, who was the city planner a few decades ago, spoke about it based on when this regulation was made, when this very restrictive regulation was made, and I understand people's desires to protect their property and for all that they've worked for. I get that. And he talked about unintentional consequences if we actually move to the recommendation that the Housing Task Force had recommended. I would say the housing crisis that we are facing now and the number of unhoused citizens that we have and that are growing are some of the unintentional consequences that we are facing because of the restrictive regulations that were put into place under Mr. Gardner. Another argument that was made was landlords will just raise the rent. Probably accurate, but you can only raise the price point to a price point that renters will pay, and a more affordable place is still better than no place at all. One thing that I think of from my own faith tradition, perhaps not your own, perhaps it is a story of a young man who asks his dad for his inheritance early so he can go off and spend it. And then, of course, he is wasteful with it and spends it all, has the time of his life, and comes back and asks for mercy. And his father meets him on the road and, of course, takes him in. And the older son, who has done all the right things, wants to protect his property and wants to protect his wealth and says, "What about me, Dad? I've done everything right." And the father says, "You're right, but this one here needs mercy," because collectively, those of us who have enough, our obligation in a society, in a civilized society, is to care for those on the margins. Our recommendation was for those on the economic margins, and this recommendation is not going to change a bit. And government's job is the common good. And that means everybody. And I don't see this recommendation. I see us taking care of those like the older brother. What about me, Dad? What about me? I know. We can protect people's property and still make sure that those on the economic edges get cared for. We have to do a better job.
Thank you. Public hearing remains open.
Mary Ann Leszewski, 1209 Wisconsin Street. While tonight's agenda focuses on newly proposed occupancy regulations, I still feel a need to address the still lobbied for definition of family to be 4 non-related individuals by the Hunger Poverty Prevention Partnership of Portage County. This partnership and the March's Plan Commission suggestion that the number of bedrooms and square footage of a house should determine how many residents can occupy it. This does not work. I think the example given was, why can't 3 people live in a 3-bedroom house? It could easily equal 3 to 6 residents in a larger home and take us right back to the rooming house problems of parking, noise, and neighborhood decline. We don't want to return to developers converting dining rooms, pantries, porches, garages, and living rooms into bedrooms, thus qualifying a house as more bedrooms for housing more tenants. Even large homes rarely have more than 2 legal parking spaces to accommodate 3 or 4 roommates. These homes serve 2 unrelated renters or a family, but not 3 or more unrelated people. They were originally designed for a single family. 3 unrelated tenants function differently in a house and a neighborhood than a single family does. The Hunger Poverty Partnership suggests that rents will be kept at 30% of income, or that the rent for one family in a home would be the same for 3 to 4 roommates. The rent always escalates for roommates if a home is converted from a single family to a rooming house. Today I heard of a bedroom being rented for $435 and somebody who's planning to convert their property into 3 rooms for rent. $435 times 3 tenants is $1,305 a month. 4 tenants would be $1,740 a month for 4 bedrooms. I don't think we can use the homeless to give a license to large developers waiting to take over single-family homes. Our homeless numbers are growing because we offer services surrounding cities do not. And yet when the homeless find they are unable to comply with required rules and regulations, they are then back out on the street and still remain in our community. Changing zoning is not the cure for homelessness. It is a much bigger issue than that. These housing codes will not affect them. 2 unrelated people renting a 1-bedroom apartment could live very economically. It has been done for decades. In the March 15th issue of the Madison Capital Times, an article addressing this very same issue titled, "Madison's New Housing Rules Stir Debate Over the City's Future." 2 residents were interviewed for this article. Mike Varda and Ron Rossner have lived in Madison's Regent neighborhood just past Camp Randall Stadium for 40 years. They can point out every house that used to be occupied by a family but is now home to roomers. It is too many in their opinion. Quote, "My first house here I abandoned in 2000 because I felt I was forced out of the neighborhood by students who would ask me, 'Why do you live in a student neighborhood, Mr. Rosner?' Well, I had to tell them, I got here before you did." They were worried about the unintended consequences of recent zoning changes the city has made by overhauled zoning from single-family neighborhoods and changing the definition of family in their city code to allow more unrelated roommates to live together. Madison's upzoning predicts that they will not have a single-family home in the downtown area in 50 years. Minneapolis and Chicago's upzoning in recent years has destroyed much of their single-family zone neighborhoods. If an area is somewhat depressed and a home goes up for sale, it will too often go immediately to rental and rarely return to owner-occupied. The most economical living for us seniors or anyone is to stay in our paid-for homes. Many rents are close to $1,000 and will only go up with inflation. And we don't want our older neighborhoods to evolve into rental-only housing for our retirement or for eventual resale purposes. We don't want our homes to be in a rental neighborhood only. John Gardner did remind us that even our prized area from the hospital to Gerke is vulnerable because of the many potential renters working at the university and at the hospital. He said we could lose our city and never get it back in those areas. The proposed entity of household, the proposed household entity and household entity plus could absorb some low-income housing needs if the definition of family can be enforced, that of blood, marriage, adoption, and etc. What I don't understand is why dependents who cannot exist or sustain themselves independently is a who is already a blood family member needs to be highlighted separately as being allowed to live in the household. And why dependent is only listed under owner-occupied dwelling. This family with a dependent could easily be in a rental property. In closing, I just feel like our new definition of family cannot be done at the expense of our city and others in the city. And while the intentions may be laudable, it cannot drive stable homeowners out of our city. Thank you.
Thank you. Public hearing remains open.
I just found out about this meeting. My name is Rich Kleinman. I live at 2101 Minnesota. Just found out about the meeting an hour ago, so I'm kind of winging it. I'm the community climate refugee and climate nerd. My house was built in 1909 when atmospheric CO2 levels were 280 parts per million, as they had been for 800,000 years before my home was built. Today, that atmospheric CO2 level is 420 parts per million. The climate doctors are telling us we have a global emergency, and we have to figure out how to reduce our per capita carbon emissions. The average home in Wisconsin takes 7 tons of CO2 emissions to power. I own my house, if I can only share it with one person, that's 3.5 tons per person. The doctors say we need to get to 2 tons per person for all of our usage. We're not going to be able to do that in America, but we need to try to go in the right direction. So allowing more people to live in a house is a baby step toward acknowledging that we have a global crisis and we are connected. We are not, there are bigger things that are happening than what exists in Stevens Point, but it's going to affect everyone on Earth. So this is an opportunity for us to raise our hands and say, there is a little something we can do as citizens of Stevens Point to recognize that we're citizens of this planet and to reduce our carbon footprint and allow a more dense housing. There's no avoiding this. As this climate crisis worsens, people are going to migrate to, poleward. People are going to come to Wisconsin. You have water here. I left a place that's running out of water. So if you want my advice to the community is, there's going to be a lot of people like me coming from out of the state who are looking for places to live. If you wait and try to restrict the housing density, you're going to get a crush of refugees, and you're going to get a bunch of out-of-town people who are going to fill these houses up. There is going to be no stopping the need for housing for people as they migrate north. So if you want to stick your head in the sand for 10 years and try to stick to the rules as they are, you can stick your head in the sand. But there are forces that are bigger than this city council can govern that are coming to planet Earth, to the United States, to Wisconsin, to Stevens Point. So I would urge you, if you don't want to have out-of-towners like me filling up your houses, to fill them up with people from Wisconsin now before out-of-town people like me fill them up instead. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Rich. Melissa?
Good evening, everyone. Melissa Johnson, 1703 Division Street. I'm the co-founder of the Housing Task Force, along with former Alder Dalton. When we first established that, or at least the framework for that, the charter, like all things that I've done in my life, I thought I knew everything, and then I found out I knew nothing. When I worked to create the county's first Diversity Affairs and Inclusion Committee, I thought I understood, the challenges of being discriminated against, and then I started meeting with stakeholders and realized I really didn't understand the experience of a lot of people. It was my same experience with the Housing Task Force. I thought that by framing up a housing task force to discuss the challenges and issues related to housing, whether it's unsheltered, housing insecurity, housing quality, housing availability, housing affordability, I quickly found out that this is so complex and so diverse in its dimensions that a housing task force couldn't hardly give it attention. Certainly, those who are unsheltered are I don't want to say a challenge, because they're our neighbors. Our neighbors shouldn't be a challenge. They are our neighbors. And they find themselves in a wide variety of situations. The woman who leaves a domestic violence partnership because she can't put up with it anymore but doesn't have a job, she may find herself living on the street. There are many people who are employed who are unsheltered. But this isn't about just the unsheltered. It's about housing insecurity. It is about trying to keep people from becoming unsheltered. If they could find the resources necessary to make their housing affordable and not live illegally, many are, this is a tool. We never said that changing the definition of family and why government is defining what my family looks like, I find disgusting, quite frankly. This is a tool. We didn't think that this would solve it. We thought this would be one tool in the toolbox, very much like expungement of felony convictions is a tool in the toolbox as it relates to housing and employment, actually. Expungement clinics would be another tool in the toolbox. Giving opportunities for more people to own their own homes is a tool in the toolbox. This is just one tool, and I agree with my dear colleague and friend, Mother Jane, that this is a watered-down version of what we had proposed. And the reason we proposed it was we recognized that many people, even when employed, are not making enough to afford the rents. So being able to live with a couple of friends would help to alleviate that financial challenge. This afternoon, I had the good fortune of meeting with a student. I meet with students quite frequently because they're just so smart and they're so wonderful and they still love life. They haven't been sullied by the reality of life. And his questions to me were about housing and homelessness. And what we were doing locally, and I'll be connecting him with my friend Jane here after the meeting, his one question to me was, why does this city hate students? And I said, Connor, why do you say that? And he said, well, it seems like everything is designed to keep students somehow targeted or under control. And I said, I don't have an answer for you. I don't hate you. I don't hate students. I see them as an amazing opportunity to build this community. But that was his perception, and that kind of hurt. I'm going to read something I found. I found this quite a while ago. This is from HUD, Housing and Urban Development. It is the Public Housing Occupancy Guideline, Section 2.2, eligible family status. And then parenthetic notation is 24 CFR, so Code of Federal Regulations, Section 5.403. Definition of eligible families. The federal rule defines certain types of families, but the PHA, this guidebook, establishes the basic definition of what is considered to be a family. A typical but not required definition of a family is all of the federal defined families, including elderly families, near elderly families, disabled families, displaced families, remaining member of a tenant family, and a single person, or two or more persons related by blood, adoption, and other, so very much like we have. However, they go on to say that it can be two or more persons who are not so related, but who live together in a stable relationship and share resources. And the reason they do this, they go on to say, is they want to be able to accommodate this example, a couple of young mothers with children who may be working shift work, and they support one another. They're not related. They share resources. They function as a unit. But they want to be able to accommodate that so we don't have one of those mothers and children living on the street, or two of them if one can't afford it. I promise I'm almost done. The way this is written, I live in a lovely 4-bedroom, 2-bath corner lot home. I do not own it. I have a great landlord. I love my home. Right now I have my daughter, my son, my grandson, and then, of course, myself. We have another bedroom. If I wanted to welcome a refugee family, mom and dad, and maybe a child, a baby, because my bedroom certainly is big enough to accommodate a family to do that, I could not welcome them. Even if my landlord said, you know what, this is the right thing to do. This is the right thing to do. This definition would not allow me to be able to assist that family. This is a tool. We need to think of the future. We can learn from the past. And I get it. People who have built wealth, there's a quote out there I read recently. Income is how we stay out of poverty. Wealth is how we keep out of poverty. People have built their wealth in their houses. I get it. That's how working class, middle class, upper middle class people build wealth. It's the single most important thing. You're protecting it. Many, many people will never know that luxury. I just want to put their heads on a pillow. Thank you.
Thank you. Public hearing remains open.
Hi, Cindy Nabel, 1100 Phillips Street, live right near campus. So I've lived in that for about 45 years now with very high density. Students across from me, there's 3 rentals that are on one piece of property because it was grandfathered in from way back, so there's about 18 students just right across from me. I have another house that's kitty corner from me that is a rooming house. I have quite a few more around me also. I also have neighbors that have lived there like I have for quite a long time. Majority of them are gone, but that are still there. They raised their kids there, and so did we. It was affordable, but when I bought our house, I had to pay 17% interest and put money down that we had to borrow and pay back, and so it was not an easy task. So we had a 30-year mortgage. We did all the things like you were saying, when people do the right thing. Do they, just give everything up? I don't think we have. I think I've been a good steward to the students that live near me. I have been a steward to the people that were elderly that were living there in my neighborhood before I became now the elderly. And I'm the senior now, and they're gone and have passed away, and those houses have gone into rental. And there's nothing wrong with rental. I've lived there that long because that isn't a horrible thing. It's affordable. I didn't want to have to give up everything for my kids not to be able to go to school and do other things. I stayed where I did because it was affordable for me. And I'm hoping I can still stay there and have that house for myself as long as I can live in it. But right now what it sounds like is there seems to be this argument about taking care of other people, but what about the elderly? We can't afford to sell my house and go find a different place because the property and the value around is getting worse and worse. I've watched it go down. My neighborhood used to be 75% families and maybe 30, maybe in between there, but of rentals, even though they were rooming house ones. And now it's complete opposite. We're the minority. And if you keep doing that, why are we putting money into our downtown to get people to come down there and spend money and be part of our economic environment if we're not going to take care of our outer layers of our neighborhoods? We haven't fought having rentals, but we have said there has to be a balance. And we're way over the balance of the core of the city. So when you talk density and you talk about putting in where someone could have more people living in them, then go look at the houses that are out. I'm sorry, but Mary, your area, there's not high density there. There's some apartments, but they're families, two unrelated people. The areas that have all the density is right here, and it's becoming overload. I have to say that, Melissa, when you said that, the two of you are related, so you could take a family in. Why couldn't you? Because it can, two unrelated, you're related.
Let's not get into individual.
Okay, so I look at that and think, if that's counted as one, basically, why wouldn't you be able to have another unrelated person with a family? Two women or men that decide that they need to live out on their own, and they have children, they're taking care of them. They would still be able to do that under our policy that we have now. That wouldn't keep them from doing that. I looked at some of the rentals recently as this conversation was on Facebook, and I saw someone that had said, this won't hurt anybody, because they're talking about she has a place that, quite a few of apartments that are 3-bedroom ones. But she puts out there that was $445 to have for rent for each of them, and I thought, okay, well, that's pretty cheap. She goes, no, that's for all. You have to pay, each person pays for each bedroom. That is how it's done in this town. You pay rent by bedroom. And so that would mean it'd be $1,320. So someone asked her in that dialogue, so what if I wanted just two people would be in there? Would we be able to pay less? No, you'd still have to pay that amount. Now, obviously, she's not paying attention to what the law already is, and I don't really care if there's 3 people in there. But that doesn't mean they're going to lower the rent. That you would just be able to add more. My son lives in a place. I asked him, what do you think? Do you think your place would be cheaper if they let you have in that little tiny bedroom that you guys use almost like a closet, but it's enough square footage for it to be a bedroom? But it's listed as a 2-bedroom, and you guys pay this amount. So do you think your landlord lady or landlord would not charge more? And he goes, oh, of course they would charge more. So he barely makes it. He makes $13 an hour. So am I proud of that? No. I know what it's like to have people that can't afford things. He's lucky he has a family. Not everybody has that. But I don't like the feeling is that when we're talking about this has been made to act like anybody that owns a home, almost like we're privileged, that we're not civilized, we don't care about other people, we're not Christian. That is really sad, because we do lots of things that are outside of the fact that we have a home, but we do what we can for other people. But because we don't want to have our more density in an area that we already have it in the core of the town, I can't move out of it. I can't move out. So are you being discriminatory to we, the seniors that have been talking here? 2 of the people here are landlords that are sitting over that talked about that this should not happen, because they know what will happen. They're good landlords. But that doesn't mean in this area where the biggest thing that's happening around the whole country is people are now investing in properties. It's the big thing to do. And so you buy up properties, you don't live around here, you rent them out, and it's not going to help the homeless. Some of the reasons why this is such a problem is because that's happening. And so the prices are up. I just want to read one thing from our 2017 housing study that we paid money for. I was an alder. I was around when we did this. And it's frustrating, but it says this: neighborhoods are an important part of everyday life in a healthy city. Within a neighborhood, residents share common experiences around housing, schools, parks, and access to health care and retail services. They also share in the negative impacts of crime or dilapidated properties, and property values and perceptions about the neighborhood. Because of this, the city has indicated a desire to identify neighborhoods and foster the creation of neighborhood associations and to have stronger neighborhoods within the city. We strongly endorse this initiative. That was written by people that we paid to look at our housing. The second thing that they mentioned, and I'm going to go to it, is the conditions of the houses around us, not just around the university, but in the older parts of our town. It's an old town. That we need to look at those places and look at what we can do to improve them, because those properties, the existing housing units, that's a majority of surveys looked at it and they said the housing was very, needed to be rehabilitated or replaced. The low-value housing units that are in the city, and that should be a top housing priority. So what we're going to do is put more people into these housing that is already not great, but we'll just put more people in it. That's not going to help anything. And lastly, when we talked about that, they said also that in an area specifically, they said it has value to change the unrelated people. It has some value in the areas around the university that we don't do that. We are concerned that a change, quote, to this ordinance could work against efforts to manage and reverse the conversion of single-family homes to rental units. And remember in the beginning, they talked about how important that foundation is to have homes. We're not saying it shouldn't be 50-50, because it almost is. But we're saying to keep increasing is not the best way to go. We recommend an approach similar to different cities, and they talked about it, that only allowed maybe up to 3. But they were not looking at it to be more, and they said around the university, perhaps up to a half-mile from the campus, while the standard applying to the rest of the city could be relaxed to 3 unrelated occupants, this area would be not changed, because it's already dense. But we're finding that that was back in 2017, and it has spread more than just around the university. So I guess my biggest thing is policies change, but they will have unintended consequences, like John Gardner said. And he's right. He was here. And I came in the late 70s and saw why there was so much housing that changed in our city because of the university not having dorms. And yes, that was a long time ago, but we're now doing it for another reason. And what happens is when we do these things because we think it's the right thing, it ends up causing a lot of other problems that are unintended consequences. And I'm talking about the elderly people that have lived here and paid their houses off and can't afford to leave somewhere just to find another house. I would not be able to do it. And if I did, I'd have to find a house that needed all the work, and I can't do that again. So thank you.
Thank you. Public hearing remains open.
Carol Malewski, 2125 Clark Street. I guess one of my first comments on this is that why does a family have to be called a household entity? I mean, if it is that first definition there, sounds like it is what a family is. Why can't we leave the word family? And then, because the other section, the next section is household entity plus, they're kind of strange names for something that is, maybe the second one should be family plus, because all of you have been using the word family and not household entity. It sounds like a piece of furniture. My comments on this are mainly, I am a landlord, and I abide by the rules. I have no more than 2 unrelated. One side of the duplex has 2 people, and I really like to keep them. They have a 3-bedroom apartment. I charge them, they each pay $405 a month, which I think is very reasonable. They have a garage. One person could put their car in the garage. The other one has to put their car right behind. There's a little backyard. The other side now has 3 related. Used to be two brothers and a third, but the third married in. So now it is a family of 3. But I have to increase their rent because my taxes have gone up. And every time I have the plumber come, that is more expensive. Every time I have it painted, it's more expensive. And they have said to me that I'm the best landlord they've had, but I have to increase my rent. And there's no way around the fact that I have not considered the fact that there's 3 on one side who divide the rent. So if I raise the rent $60, it's 3 people paying the $60 every month, which comes out to $20 more a month, which isn't a whole lot. But if it was a family, it would be 80 or 60 or 80, depending on how high I raise it. And obviously, any renter who is even responsible does not want to be in the hole. And fortunately, that duplex was in the family. So I lived there when I was young for a very long time, so I don't have a mortgage on it. But yet, I still have to increase the tax because it's expensive. It's expensive to do upkeep. Pretty soon I'm going to need a new roof, you know. And I split this with my brother. And so as far as taking money out, we take out next to nothing because we put it back in again, you know. So just a comment on landlords and expenses. You know, I'm just very familiar with that. And I'm starting from a substantial house. I'm not starting, I mean, I could probably put more people in there, you know, because of the size of it. But my dad, having been a realtor, said, people moving out 5 times is like a small fire. It's really hard on a house, particularly when they're renters. They don't care for it the same way that somebody that owns the place does. So as far as 4 people unrelated in a place, you know, some of those people are going to move in and out, just like my tenants. I mean, one will stay, the other one will move out. So it's kind of a revolving door in some ways, but it is still people moving in and out. It doesn't make for stability in the neighborhood. And as Cindy Nebel said, the center part of the city there's a balance there. And a lot of people have maintained those single-family houses. And how long are they going to do that? We do not want a central city that is 70 or 80% rental, because for the people that are renting, it's not going to be a good thing either, because they don't have a stable neighbor. It'll be renters that are moving in and out. So please do consider, I think some of those, as it was mentioned, that perhaps neighborhood should be looked at as far as how many extra rentals there should be in the neighborhood. Maybe it's looking at those details that will make this a more viable option. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Public hearing remains open.
Greg Hansel, 525 Clayton Avenue, Stevens Point. Nobody's a bad person here, okay? You're not. And I don't want to judge anybody. One thing, though, I've learned, I'm getting to be an old man, is that one of the things I'm really good at is self-deception. You know, I can confuse myself and believe that I've done something great, and I really haven't. And this is not an easy situation. I understand it. I understand both sides. But what's proposed really does very, very little. Really doesn't help. Because, you know, I had a friend today who told us that their son tried to buy a house, and they bid over the price, and they have 2 good jobs, and it was over $300,000 because there's not homes available. So we're only helping people that are able to own a house. And we're not talking about the homeless here. I'm not talking about the homeless at all. It's a whole different category. I'm talking about working poor. So I want us to be careful about, you know, if this gets approved and we'll say, gee, we did something. We didn't do diddly. Because this isn't going to change much at all. Okay? And, you know, I support the Housing Task Force, but there's room in between there if you have to, for goodness sakes. You know, but what's being proposed now is, I think it's self-deception. And I don't mean any judgment of anybody else. I think Carol said there's more to it. You know, this is a tough issue. Cindy said that too. I get that. But, you know, we have to help people. I'm talking about the working poor. $13 an hour, $13 an hour. You can't buy a house. It's hard to pay rent. You know that. So we got to do more than this. Thanks.
Public hearing is still open.
Mark Christensen, 1641 Clark Street. I think it's important to remember when Director Kronowski said the impact that this would have, it's not changing the amount of unrelated individuals. What's being proposed by staff, as I understand it, is just an increase if it's owner occupied. Pretty small step. I do think, actually, Greg and I probably kind of agree. I see this as just being a beginning, and we can kind of monitor it and see what kind of an impact it has, and then see if further steps need to be taken. But this, as proposed, since it's only going to increase only if it's owner occupied, a lot of the things that people have indicated are concerns aren't going to be coming to pass with the addition of this new language. I think it's probably not quite what we need yet. I think it's a first step, and we'll see how things go. So I guess I'm supportive of taking that first step and then seeing what kind of an impact it does have.
Thank you. Public hearing remains open. Public hearing is still open. For the third and final time, the public hearing is open.
Ryan Carroll, 1024 Park Street. I just wanted to point out that we're in a weird economic time coming up soon, and we don't know how bad it's going to get, really, and it could be getting bad already, depending on who you ask. But I think that keeping it with two unrelated individuals in one house is a very bad decision, because more people are probably going to lose their jobs. We don't live in a bubble in Stevens Point, as much as we'd like to think that we all live on Sesame Street here, or we want it to be like Sesame Street here. I think that things really need to change. We need to look at how other cities operate and how they've handled different economic crises when they've had different housing situations. That's about it.
Thank you. Sesame Street, I get to be Ernie.
Cookie Monster.
Ooh, that's probably more appropriate. You're right.
Well, I was talking about me.
Leo White. I live at 1926 Dixon Street. Went to school here at the university. I'm a business owner in the community. As a young person, hoping to buy a house one day. Like many people have made the argument for tonight, that one of the easiest ways to build some wealth to do that would be to live with more than two unrelated individuals in a house in order to save money on rent. That being said, too, to the people on the other side of the argument, if you want your houses to sell to people who live and care for this community, there's going to have to be a way for us to build wealth and get money in order to buy those homes. Or, you know, the people from California and Arizona and Utah, they're going to come up and buy the houses, and they're going to jack up the rent. And they're, you know, everyone's going to be out of housing if that's the case. So, you know, I think what you guys have proposed is a pretty watered down version of what we need, and I would just like you guys to consider it further and come back with a stronger definition and a stronger, you know, amendment to what you have.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Rich, where'd you come from?
What?
Where did you come from?
California.
I see where this is going.
And I'm telling you, real estate's a lot cheaper than it is in California. I could buy a 4-bedroom house for the price of a closet in California. And 20 to 25% of the houses that are sold here are sold to out-of-state investors.
Yeah.
So they're buying up the housing stock, and when they want to move here, they're just going to come.
Public hearing is still open. Public hearing remains open. And now for the third and final time, the public hearing is open. Okay, seeing no one else wishing to provide testimony, Carol, you're killing me.
I know.
We gotta have you up here, though.
I always have something to say. Again, Carol Malewski, and it is basically a comment to this person. You know, you can move here, but I can't move there because the prices of houses here are reasonable. So in that sense, as Cindy said, she can't necessarily move out of her neighborhood. And when I look at the prices of houses out of my neighborhood, in Stevens Point, if I was going to move into a quiet neighborhood, you know, a little bit smaller house than mine, it's not the same price as mine. Mine is cheaper, and I wouldn't be able to move to that other place. So just a comment on that. Right here in Stevens Point.
All right, with that, I'll declare the public hearing closed. Bring it back to the commissioners. Commissioners, comments, thoughts, or a motion? Mr. Schuler.
I have struggled with this from the very beginning of the discussion. I really appreciate the work, the long work that the Housing Task Force did to bring forward a variety of recommendations. And we decided to lead with this particular aspect of their recommendations, to take a look at how to accommodate more people within existing homes. And there's no way to negate or diminish comments made on either side of this argument tonight. And I just, as a plan commissioner, I know that given the breadth and depth of the work that the task force did, I'd like to think that our job is going to be ongoing as we move through the comprehensive plan to try to figure out what reasonable changes to housing policies are, and this happens to be the first one out of the gate. With regard to discussions in neighborhoods, I know that's the initial approach of staff to upgrading the comprehensive plan, is to do neighborhood by neighborhood discussions. I'd like to think that that can offer a bit of insight, even more so, to the discussion that this has generated about neighborhoods. And I know that you can just go back and forth in your mind all the time. There's a simple step to take that is a step, but albeit not substantial, but an indication of moving towards something that perhaps could be amplified later, right? And I'm Mr. Hansel shaking his head going, that ain't never going to happen. But but you can only take a step. And I'm not arguing for it, but to not do anything is to punt. Of course, this is a, what do you even call this if it goes backwards for the people who are really concerned about it. So I guess my only comments, they're not very satisfactory, but I'm really internally at a loss for how to really do something that's useful for the community. I don't think we want to take a step. And whatever decision gets made, it's the council that makes the final decision. So whatever recommendation, if any, comes out of the Plan Commission, it's up to the council to take that recommendation and do as it pleases. So with that, I appreciate all the comments. I understand both sides of this, and I'm just kind of struggling with what a proper way forward is.
Okay. Anyone else, or a motion? Alder Nebo.
I'll make this real personal. I'm on a fixed income. Social Security and a small pension, and a little bit of a draw from some retirement money that I have saved over the course of about 50 years. So tomorrow night, there's going to be a vote that could dramatically increase my property taxes and could tax me out of my home. People have talked about wanting seniors to stay in their homes. I want to stay in my home. I have a 3-bedroom house. I'd be willing to move into the littlest room and rent 2 bedrooms to 4 people. to help pay my property taxes and to reduce my carbon footprint, which is a good unintended benefit, which I had no knowledge of until about a week ago, and I really appreciate the fact that I could do something, some small thing, not only to benefit people in my community. I mean, I could see, you know, a little Golden Girls thing going on in my household.
Sesame Street to Golden Girls.
I mean, yeah, we could do Sesame Street too. I'm sure I know a couple people who would qualify for Oscar the Grouch.
You got a few of those.
Including myself sometimes. But I'd been thinking pretty much that owner-occupied plus 2 would be enough, but now I'm thinking maybe it needs to be 3 or 4. Just because of what could be coming down the road in terms of tax implications. Well, I've got neighbors that are already talking about moving because taxes are high as it is. It's not going to take much to drive people like me out of my home. And my mortgage right now is only $475 a month. I can't afford a 3-bedroom, anything for that much. So if I don't have this option, where am I going to go? I just don't know.
How about a $180 million jail?
Oh, yeah. I might have to because
get your room there.
that'd be the only place I could find housing. I might have to commit a nice little white-collar crime. But
I'm going to take a minute and, I'm sorry, you finished?
no, I think we have to start with this. I would like to look at it again in a year and maybe increase that number. If you want to encourage young people to stay here, let 3 or 4 of them buy a house together. You've got an owner-occupied interest in a home. Somebody's going to stay. They'll be stable neighbors. They'll build wealth. They'll stay in the community, and they'll be creative, wonderful older people and mayors in the future. So we want to keep these folks here, and we want to keep people like me in my home. So I'm very much supportive of this, and I will move to approve this.
Thank you. Have a second?
I'll second.
Commissioner Arnson
For the
seconds.
sake of it going forward to council anyway.
Yes.
Pete, did you have?
I got a question and it wasn't getting around to me.
Pete, any comments?
Adam, a couple sessions ago, we were talking about this, and one of the topics was changing the +1 individual to essentially an additional household entity. There were discussions, it was brought up, one individual is much more limiting. That doesn't account for a single parent or elderly folks or something. And so that would be one way to kind of expand the breadth of this change. I do like the idea of giving the owner-occupied an incentive and emphasizing that. And I agree with the idea that doing something is better than nothing, and maybe changing that one individual could be done at a later time. One question I had, both with family and household entity, is why is the individual included in that definition rather than being included in the zoning classification, I guess? A household entity isn't a household entity. It's a household entity plus something else. And that's, the household entity being the same definition as a family. So I just think the whole definition part is a little deceiving, but maybe that's just how that is. But the suggested change then would essentially be a household entity plus one additional household entity, and if you're owner-occupied, it would be 2 additional household entities, which could essentially mean 3 families, if that logic follows at all.
Lost in semantics.
I was going to say, I didn't follow that one.
What's that?
I think we're lost in semantics.
Mayor,
Hang on. We're going to ask Director Karnowski to speak.
Yeah, so The definition that's before you, for whatever reason, didn't include the plus dependents, which is what it should have included. So you are correct. There was an earlier speaker who had said, well, I live in this home with my family, and if we wanted to take in another family, we couldn't. That, for, again, just staff oversight isn't correct in what we intended. We wanted to be essentially you could have two household entities or two families living together if it was a renter occupied, and that was to address the concern of like if you have a single parent and their dependents, you could have two single parents and their dependents living legally within our code. And I just just to take a quick liberty, if I may, Mayor. Staff has really struggled with this conversation. I mean, it's, we staffed the housing task force discussion, and we saw and we're part of the discussions there, and we were part of the discussions in December. And, quite honestly, I mean, this is like 3 a.m. I'm waking up in the middle of the night being like, how do we address this? And, this isn't the single arrow that's going to deal with all of the housing insecurities within our community. Is staff even happy with the recommendation? Not necessarily. We would have preferred to see something across the board, but we thought incremental steps will get us there at some point. And that's a lot of times with zoning change and zoning regulation, you look at incrementalism as the way to get to a bigger change because a variety of reasons. This is the right way to do it. But we also have to look at from staff's perspective, how are we going to enforce these policies, right? I mean, that's oftentimes forgotten. One of the challenges that we have now is unless somebody practically tells our zoning administrator that yes, we have 4 unrelated people living here, and we know that it was a single family prior to that, we have no other ways for us to actually enforce the current code. There's no way for us, unless we get like an inspection warrant or we ask for birth certificates or blood or DNA samples. It's very difficult for us to enforce the current definition. And I'm not saying that the proposed definition is going to be any more easy to enforce, but it gives us a little bit more wiggle room as we go through this process. So again, this is an incremental step in the right direction. In a perfect world, I think my preference would be do 3 across the board plus dependents. And I do have to apologize because of the dependent sentence within the household entity, and the household entity plus was for whatever reason excluded. My apologies on that, but at council will be the household entity plus dependents as part of it. So.
And Ryan, you said that this was keeping you up at 3 a.m. Are you sure it wasn't Adeline's feeding?
In December and January, it definitely was not my child. So.
All right.
So to clarify, this definition should say, an individual or 2, et cetera, or such individual, plus 1 individual with dependents?
I had originally written it was the household is an individual or 2 or more persons related by blood, marriage, adoption, foster child arrangement, or similar legal relationship, plus their dependents and functioning as a single housekeeping entity. Something like that. I have the other language, and I'll be certain to include that with the council agenda packet.
So do we make an amendment proposal to add?
No, I think you can approve it with the change recommended, because it just gets forwarded to council for approval. The accurate definition will be before the council. So if you wanted to amend your motion to include that dependent line as presented by the director, that would be appropriate. Mary, you made the motion.
If we then I would make that amendment if it's
okay. Do you agree to that as a second?
Yes, I would agree with that as a second, yes.
Okay, so the motion before you is to approve the definitions as presented, adding dependents to the household entity and household entity plus.
I'm not sure that's exactly right. It's the or such individual plus 1 individual. That's the one whose dependents we're talking about, correct?
No, let me give you a hypothetical situation. Let's say there was a widowed man with 3 sons, and one day he met a lady who was bringing up 3 very lovely girls. They would be, even though they weren't married at the time, they would be 2 household entities which would be allowed under the definition, 2 unrelateds. If they added a housekeeper, for example, that would be illegal, but under this definition, that would still be okay. You throw in a dog named Tiger, and we got a bunch of fun.
Maybe Alice needs to go move in with the Golden Girls.
Does that make sense, Pete? Commissioner?
That makes sense.
2 household entities, so.
Right, right. And that's what my initial point was. So we're getting, as it says here, it's just an individual, which is just one person. That individual, we're actually talking about a household entity, but is a household entity the same as a dependent?
No, so it's an individual or 2 or more persons related.
Yes, plus 1 individual.
And their dependents.
And their dependents, yes.
So the individual and household entity plus would also include dependents.
Good.
The term household entity is replacing the previous term family. It only describes what is going on within the residential unit. It's not a unit made up of entities, it's an entity made up of people.
Does that make sense?
Because we were talking about multiple entities, unless I heard you wrong, but it's just a simple word for describing who's living in the household unit.
In the Brady Bunch analogy, Commissioner, you could have, if Mike and Carol weren't married, they could have Alice could have a dependent and still qualify under the household entity plus.
All right.
If it were owner occupied.
All right.
And if we could have Director Karnowski read back what his version of the actual statement is, so we have a better understanding of it in total.
Did you hear that, Director? They just want a restatement of the dependent portion that you just read.
Yes, so it would be a household entity is an individual or 2 or more persons related by blood, marriage, adoption, foster child arrangement, or similar legal relationship, and functioning as a single housekeeping entity, or such individual or person, and it should say, or such individual or person plus 1 individual and their dependents not having such similar legal relationship but functioning as part of the single housekeeping entity. And then you would just replicate that under household entity plus. And that would satisfy what the intention was, and that would be what staff would put forward to council. And just as a reminder, if we're generally okay with the dependents, we don't need to get into the nuance. City staff will ensure that when this is presented to council, it meets what the Plan Commission had discussed.
Okay.
All right, but now one more thing. The individual plus dependent is not the same as 2 or more persons related by blood, marriage, etc. So, is that correct?
So, again, the spirit of the discussion is one person who lives in the house, another person who lives in the house, those people are not related, plus their dependents. So, again, we will verify, we'll vet this to make sure that the spirit of what this discussion is presented to the council, but it would include the dependents of both I'll call the initial household entity and then the second household entity, which would be the 1 or 2 individuals plus their dependents. But it's clear as mud.
So could 2 brothers be 2 brothers aren't an individual and a dependent necessarily, but they do meet the blood requirement. So would 2...
They would equal a household entity.
But isn't household entity the same as a individual?
If you don't mind, Mr. Arnson, let me just give it a quick example.
Yes.
So under the current code, you could have 1 person and another person who is not related, and that's all you could have. You could not, you could have 1 family plus 1 individual, not their dependents. That's what the current definition says. Under the proposed amendment, you would be able to have the family plus essentially a second family residing in the dwelling unit. And if it was owner occupied, you would have I'll call it the primary family, and then you could have 2 secondary families, because the individuals plus their dependents would be allowed to reside within the dwelling unit. As opposed to right now, our code prohibits dependents from residing with non-family members, essentially.
So that's where I'm getting hung up now, is the individual and dependent, do brothers qualify as an individual and a dependent? They're essentially
Brothers qualify under the definition of family, and there would be no, you wouldn't fall within this rule or regulation. You could have 2 brothers and their dependents under our current code, and they would be legal. But if it was 2 brothers and then 2 of their friends and their dependents, as long as it's owner occupied, it would be acceptable.
Does that make sense, Pete?
Yes.
Okay. Because I think we're getting hung up between household entity and individual. We're not talking about an
Individual
individual.
plus dependent is where I'm getting hung up.
But we need to talk about household entity and household entity plus. An entity is 1 or more people who have that relationship. So having 2 household entities allows unrelated.
This doesn't say 2 household entities. It says an individual, and it's supposed to say individual plus dependent.
Yes.
And my point is that an individual plus dependent is not the same as a household entity. And if it is, why don't we just use household entity?
Okay, I now see where you're coming from.
You're reading the code incorrectly. So it says an individual or 2 or more persons. So the 2 or more persons would constitute a separate family or a household entity. And that's where I think we're getting confused.
It is confusing, Director. I think the issue is that it's not as we intended to present in this iteration. So perhaps what we need to do is just pass it on to council, have it corrected with the definition of dependents or adding dependents to it, and have that presented at council in 2 weeks. Because I think you understand the intention of what the Plan Commission is hoping.
Certainly, right. I just think it doesn't say it.
Now you just need to put those words on paper.
Yeah, and again, we will, and that's an administrative oversight. It should have included plus dependents, so I do apologize for that.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I think that I will vote in favor of the motion only because we've had many meetings on this and have not indicated any ability to come up with a different type of processing of the information or options. And I think that at this point in time, the people who can actually make the decision can have a thorough discussion of it as best they can with staff there to answer any questions. And I think that's where it needs to go so that people can have a resolution. Otherwise, we could bring this back another 4 months in a row and we would have the same conversation because, again, I see 2 sides that have very well-considered opinions about this, and we can't decide, we can only recommend. So I think it's time for it to go to council and let this become Mark Christensen's problem.
Fair enough.
Do we need to withdraw the amendment, or do we need to vote on that? Or is that, because I'm willing to withdraw.
I think what would be appropriate is
we can make this recommendation, and figuring we've talked about it, you'll
Right.
fix it by the time it goes to the people that can actually
yes, and the
decide.
motion actually includes that fix. So I think we're okay with voting on the motion.
Okay.
Further discussion? Clear as mud?
If we all understand the
I think we understand
motion.
the intent. It was, as Ryan said, it was an administrative oversight on the definitions. We'll get that fixed. Everyone, of course, is welcome and encouraged to attend the council meeting. The agenda will be out the Thursday before the council meeting.
Okay.
All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? And that's approved and will be forwarded to council. Item number 7 is a request from the city of Stevens Point to enter into an electric underground easement agreement with Wisconsin Public Service Corporation for a property located at 4401 State Highway 66 and 2 unaddressed parcels off of State Highway 66 with those identified in your packet. Adam?
Nothing really further to say outside of, as I mentioned, Director Lemke was working with WPS for this request, and namely it's to provide another access point for well number 10 located on the bottom half of page 51 of the packet.
Okay. Motion?
Move to approve.
Thank you. Seconded by Schuler. Discussion.
How long is the easement? I didn't look
Forever.
and see that. Saw how wide it is. It looks pretty long.
Yeah, I don't know if it says offhand.
Duration.
Yeah, I don't think it says offhand the length of it, but 12 foot wide.
All right.
You could calculate it, but.
It's this purple line, right? It's a
dashed blue line.
Do the math in your head.
And purple.
No, I'm not a surveyor.
It's only 3 inches long of legal
All right.
description.
Any comments from the audience? Until we've been here too long. You said, how long is it? I'm like, it's forever. What do you mean? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? And that's approved. Item number 8, the March monthly report.
Included within your agenda packet is the March monthly report. Nothing substantial to report. I would recommend putting on file.
Any questions? Comments or a motion to accept and place on file?
Motion to accept and place on file.
Thank you. Do we have a second? Seconded by Aronson. Discussion? Hearing and seeing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? And that's approved. Director's report. Floor is yours, Director.
Great Northern Distilling has obtained their certificate of occupancy. The certificate of occupancy for the 1965 edition of the convent will be issued this week. The city has closed on the following properties: the Anderson subdivision, as it's informally known as, on Gala Road, Old 18 and Berlowski, and then we do close on the convent parcel this week as well. I believe that's all I have, other than Sandy Kratzky in our city assessor's office celebrated 31 years of service to the city today.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Wow.
And I can tell you that Great Northern had a soft opening on Sunday. It's my understanding that at 4 p.m. on Wednesday, they will be officially open to the public. And with that, our agenda is exhausted, and we stand adjourned at 7:31.
A video of this meeting is available for viewing on the city's website, stevenspoint.com/videos.